Here's something nobody wants to admit. The people who see the truth first are usually the ones nobody's listening to. They're the misfits, the loners, the ones standing awkwardly at the edge of every social gathering, watching. And society hates them for it. Why? Because they see through the performance. They spot the lies everyone else has agreed to believe. And that makes people deeply, deeply uncomfortable. But here's the thing. That discomfort, that alienation you might be feeling right now, it's not a weakness. It's a superpower you just haven't learned to use yet. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you why the greatest minds in history, Camus, Nietzsche, Jung, Frankl, all understood that outsiders have access to a kind of clarity that well-adjusted people will never experience. We're talking about the psychology of the outsider, the hidden advantage of not fitting in, and why your alienation might be the exact thing that saves you from a life of comfortable delusion. Stick with me until the end because we're going to flip everything you thought you knew about belonging on its head. And if this resonates with you, if you've ever felt like you're watching life from the outside, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We're building a community of people who think differently, and your support helps us keep making content that actually matters. Now, let's dive in.
The uncomfortable gift of not belonging.
You know that feeling when you're sitting in a room full of people and somehow you're not really there? Everyone's laughing at the same jokes, nodding at the same ideas, moving like one organism, and you're just watching. It's not that you're better than them, it's that you can't unsee what you're seeing. That distance, that gap between you and the group, it feels like a curse, doesn't it? But here's what nobody tells you. That uncomfortable space is where clarity lives. When you're on the outside looking in, you're not caught up in the performance. You see the stage, the actors, the script, everyone's following without even knowing it. The outsider psychology isn't about being difficult or contrarian. It's about having a vantage point that participation simply doesn't allow. Think about it like this. If you're in the middle of a parade, you're swept up in the energy, the music, the movement. You're part of it, and that feels good. But you can't see the parade. You can't see where it's going, who's leading it, or if it's headed toward a cliff. The misfit advantage kicks in precisely because you're not marching. You're standing on the sidewalk, watching the whole thing unfold. And yeah, it's lonely. Yeah, it stings when everyone else seems to belong to something you can't access. But that sting? It's the price of sight. Social alienation forces you to ask questions others never think to ask because they're too busy keeping step. You start noticing patterns, inconsistencies, the gap between what people say and what they do. That's not cynicism. That's existential awareness in action. Now, I'm not saying every loner is a genius or every misfit has it figured out. Plenty of people are isolated because they're bitter or stuck or just plain difficult. But when alienation isn't chosen out of ego, when it's thrust upon you, or when it emerges naturally because your mind works differently, that's when the real advantage shows up. You're forced to think for yourself. There's no social safety net to catch you, no groupthink to lean on. You've got to build your own framework for understanding the world, and in doing that, you develop something rare, independent thinking that isn't performative. You're not trying to look smart or seem deep. You're just trying to make sense of a world that doesn't make sense to you the way it apparently does for everyone else. Here's the kicker, though. Once you start seeing things clearly, you can't go back. You can't unknow what you know. That clarity doesn't come with an off switch, and that's both the gift and the curse of the outsider. The philosophical outsider doesn't just observe, they absorb, they question, they reconstruct reality from scratch because the default version never quite fit. And while everyone else is comfortable in their shared illusions, you're out here holding a truth that nobody asked for. But don't worry, we're just getting started on understanding why that truth matters more than the comfort everyone else is clinging to.
The Stranger's Clarity. Camus and the View from Outside.
Albert Camus gave us one of the most unsettling characters in modern literature, Meursault the stranger. A guy who doesn't cry at his mother's funeral, who doesn't fake emotion, who refuses to play the social game everyone else is playing. And society? Society wants to destroy him for it. Not because he committed a crime, though he does, but because he won't pretend. He won't perform grief, won't manufacture meaning where he doesn't feel it, won't lie to make others comfortable. Camus wasn't writing about a sociopath. He was writing about what happens when someone refuses to participate in the collective fiction. Meursault's emotional distance isn't cruelty. It's honesty. And that honesty terrifies people because it reveals how much of social life is just theater. The Camus stranger shows us that when you step outside the script, people don't ask why. They just want you gone. But here's where it gets interesting. That same detachment, that refusal to buy into the performance, gives the outsider something invaluable: the ability to see what's really happening. When you're not emotionally invested in maintaining the illusion, you notice things. You see how people lie to themselves, how they twist reality to fit their self-image, how entire systems operate on unspoken agreements that everyone pretends are natural laws. Truth and isolation go hand in hand, because isolation removes the pressure to conform your perception to the group's perception. You're not worried about being liked, so you can afford to be honest. You're not afraid of being cast out because, well, you're already out. That gives you a kind of freedom that's almost dangerous to the status quo anyway. Camus also wrote about the absurd, the idea that life has no inherent meaning, and we're all just making it up as we go. But instead of despairing, he argued we should embrace it. The outsider already lives in that space. They've already accepted that the emperor has no clothes, that the game is rigged, that the rules are arbitrary. And once you accept that, you stop wasting energy pretending otherwise. You stop chasing validation from systems that were never designed to value you. You start building your own meaning, your own values, your own sense of what matters. That's existential clarity in its rawest form. It's not comfortable, and it's not comforting, but it's real. And in a world that's drowning in fakery, real is a rare commodity. Now, this doesn't mean the outsider is always right or that alienation automatically grants wisdom. But it does mean the outsider has access to a perspective that insiders don't. When you're embedded in the system, you defend it. You have to. Your identity, your status, your sense of self. It's all tied up in that system. But when you're outside, you've got nothing to defend. You can look at the whole thing objectively, see its flaws, question its assumptions. And that's exactly why misfits often see the truth first. They're not protecting anything. They're just observing. An observation without attachment? That's where insight begins to crystallize into something you can actually use.
Nietzsche's observer, beyond the herd mentality.
Nietzsche had a lot to say about the herd, and none of it was flattering. He looked at society and saw a mass of people who traded their individuality for the comfort of the crowd. They think the same thoughts, value the same things, fear the same fears, not because those thoughts and values are true, but because everyone else agrees. It's easier that way. Safer. You don't have to take responsibility for your own beliefs if you're just going along with what's already established. But Nietzsche also knew that real growth, real insight, real strength, none of that comes from the herd. It comes from the people willing to stand apart, to question, to risk being called arrogant or crazy or difficult. The Nietzsche perspective is clear. The herd mentality isn't just limiting. It's a slow death of the soul. Here's the thing about herds. They need leaders, sure, but mostly they need sameness. They need everyone to be roughly the same, think roughly the same, act roughly the same. Because if someone starts thinking too differently, the whole structure becomes unstable. That's why societies punish nonconformists so harshly. It's not personal, it's structural. The system requires conformity to function, and the outsider, by simply existing, by thinking independently, poses a threat. Not a violent threat, but something worse, a conceptual one. If you can step outside the agreed-upon reality and be fine, then maybe the reality isn't as real as everyone thought. Maybe it's just a shared hallucination. And if that's true, then what the hell is everyone doing with their lives? Nietzsche didn't romanticize the outsider's position. He knew it was hard. He knew it came with suffering, loneliness, misunderstanding. He lived it himself, dismissed, mocked, ignored for most of his life. But he also knew that this suffering had a purpose. It was the forge in which stronger, clearer, more authentic human beings were made. The nonconformist mindset isn't about rebellion for rebellion's sake. It's about refusing to let the herd define your reality. It's about taking back the authority over your own mind, your own values, your own life. And yeah, that means you'll be misunderstood. Yeah, you'll spend a lot of time alone. But you'll also be awake in a way most people never are. You'll see the truth because you're not afraid of what it costs to see it. And here's where Nietzsche ties into everything we've been talking about. The outsider doesn't just observe the herd, they transcend it. They move beyond the need for approval, beyond the fear of rejection, beyond the shallow comforts of conformity. They become what Nietzsche called the free spirit, someone who thinks for themselves, who creates their own values, who doesn't need the crowd to tell them what's real. That's the hidden advantage of alienation. It's not that you're cast out. It's that being cast out forces you to become something the herd could never produce. An independent thinker with the courage to see what others won't. But that courage? It doesn't come cheap. And the deeper you go into this truth, the more you realize just how much the outsider carries. Not just insight, but responsibility.
Jung's shadow work. What misfits see that others deny?
Carl Jung understood something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. We're not who we think we are. Underneath the polished persona, the socially acceptable self, there's a shadow, a repository of everything we've denied, repressed, ignored, and rejected about ourselves. In society? Society's got a shadow too, a collective one, filled with all the ugly truths we agree not to talk about. The comfortable lie we tell ourselves that everything's fine, that the system works, that people are basically good. But the outsider? They can't avoid the shadow. They live too close to it. Social alienation puts you in direct contact with what everyone else is running from. And once you see it, you can't pretend it's not there. Here's the thing Jung figured out. The shadow isn't just negative. Yeah, it contains our worst impulses, our fears, our shame. But it also contains our power, our creativity, our authenticity. Everything we buried to fit in, to be acceptable, to avoid conflict. Most people never reclaim that stuff because doing so would mean admitting they've been living a lie. It would mean confronting painful truths about themselves and the world they've been defending. But misfits? They don't have the luxury of denial. When you're already rejected, you've got nothing to lose by being honest. You start asking questions like, why do I feel this way? And what am I really afraid of? And what parts of myself did I kill to try to belong? That's shadow work, and it's brutal, but it's also liberating. Think about how this plays out in real life. The person who's perfectly adjusted, who fits in seamlessly, who never questions anything, they're not healthier than the misfit. They're just better at repression. They've successfully buried their doubts, their fears, their real desires under a mountain of social conditioning. They function, sure, but they don't live. The outsider, on the other hand, is forced to confront all that buried material because there's no social structure buffering them from it. They feel the anxiety, the alienation, the existential dread that everyone else is medicating with distraction and conformity. And yeah, that's painful, but it's also real. And from that realness, from that willingness to face the shadow, comes a kind of psychological depth that well-adjusted people simply don't have. Jung also talked about individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are, as opposed to who society wants you to be. And guess what? That process almost always requires a period of alienation. You have to step away from the collective to figure out what's yours versus what was programmed into you. The outsider's already done that, often involuntarily. They've been pushed to the margins, forced to question everything, compelled to build an identity that isn't just a reflection of social expectations. That's why they see what others deny. They're not protecting a false self anymore. They've already lost that game, so they might as well see the truth. And the truth they see? It's not just about themselves. It's about the whole damn system. But seeing that truth comes with a weight, a burden that most people would rather not carry. And that's exactly what we need to talk about next.
Frankl's meaning in isolation. Purpose beyond belonging.
Viktor Frankl survived the Nazi concentration camps, and what he learned there changed psychology forever. He realized that the people who made it through weren't necessarily the strongest or the smartest. They were the ones who had a reason to survive. A purpose. Something that gave their suffering meaning. And here's the brutal irony. Sometimes the people with the deepest sense of meaning are the ones who've been stripped of everything else. When you lose your status, your comfort, your sense of belonging, when you're completely isolated, you're forced to ask the question most people avoid their whole lives. What's the point? And in answering that question honestly, you find something that social acceptance could never give you. You find meaning that's yours alone. The outsider lives in a strange kind of freedom. They're not chasing approval because they've already learned it's not coming. They're not trying to impress anyone because they've been dismissed too many times to care. That forces a confrontation with the big questions. Why am I here? What matters to me? What would I do even if nobody was watching? Even if nobody cared? Even if I never got credit? Those aren't abstract philosophical questions when you're alone. They're survival questions. They're the difference between sinking into bitterness and finding a reason to keep going. And Frankl's insight was this. Meaning isn't something you find in comfort or acceptance. It's something you create in the face of suffering, isolation, and difficulty. Now, let's be real. Most people derive their sense of purpose from external validation. They feel meaningful when they're liked, when they're successful, when they fit into a role that society approves of. But that's a fragile foundation. What happens when the approval stops? What happens when you lose the job, the relationship, the status? For most people, it's a crisis. But for the outsider, it's just Tuesday. They've already learned that meaning can't come from outside. It has to come from within. They've already accepted that nobody's coming to save them, that the world doesn't owe them anything, that belonging isn't a prerequisite for purpose. And that acceptance, as painful as it is, becomes the foundation for something much stronger than conditional self-worth. Frankl also talked about the existential vacuum, this sense of emptiness that comes when you don't have a clear purpose. And society's response to that vacuum is usually distraction. Work harder, buy more, scroll endlessly, stay busy. But the outsider can't distract themselves as easily because they're already on the outside of those systems. They're forced to sit with the emptiness, to feel it fully, to ask what it's really about. And in doing that, they often discover something remarkable, that the emptiness isn't a problem to solve. It's a question to answer. What will I fill this with? And unlike the herd, which fills it with whatever's trending, the outsider gets to choose consciously. They get to build a life of purpose beyond belonging, meaning beyond approval. But that's a heavy gift to carry, and it comes with a price. And that price? That's where we're headed next.
The outsider's burden and power.
So let's talk about the cost. Because everything we've covered, the clarity, the insight, the freedom from groupthink, it all sounds great until you're sitting alone at 2 a.m., wondering if maybe you're just broken. The outsider's burden is real, and it's heavy. You see things others don't, which means you're constantly watching people make the same mistakes, chase the same illusions, repeat the same patterns. And you can't say anything because they're not ready to hear it. They're invested in the game. They need to believe the game matters. So you watch, you wait. You carry knowledge that's useless until someone's ready to receive it. That's isolating in a way that's hard to explain. It's not just physical loneliness, it's intellectual and existential loneliness. You're alone in your understanding. But here's the flip side. That burden is also your power. Because while everyone else is running on autopilot, you're awake. You're thinking. You're questioning. You're building something real instead of just performing someone else's script. The philosophical outsider doesn't just critique the system. They create alternatives. They write the books, make the art, develop the ideas that eventually shift how everyone else thinks. Not because they're trying to be revolutionary, but because they can't do anything else. They've seen too much to go back. And that vision, as uncomfortable as it is, becomes the raw material for something transformative. You're not just observing the world, you're reimagining it. Think about the people who've changed history, who've shifted paradigms, who've introduced ideas that seemed crazy at first, but became obvious in hindsight. Almost all of them were outsiders, misfits, people who didn't fit the mold, who were dismissed or mocked or ignored before they were celebrated. Camus, Nietzsche, Jung, Frankl, all of them operated on the margins of their fields, their societies, their times. They had the misfit advantage because they weren't trying to protect the status quo. They were trying to tell the truth. And truth-telling is a dangerous business when everyone's invested in the lie. But it's also the only business worth being in if you've already been cast out of the comfortable one. Now, here's the responsibility that comes with this. If you're an outsider, if you see what others don't, you have a choice. You can become bitter, resentful, superior, looking down on everyone who's still asleep. Or you can use what you see to help. Not by forcing your insights on people who aren't ready, but by being there when they start to wake up. By creating work, ideas, conversations that offer an alternative to the mainstream narrative. By showing that there's another way to live, think, and be. That's the real power of the outsider. Not just seeing the truth, but holding space for others to see it too when they're ready. And that's not a burden. That's a calling. But it requires you to stay grounded, stay honest, and keep going even when nobody's paying attention. Because eventually, they will be.
The choice every outsider must make.
So here we are. You've made it to the end. And if you're still watching, you already know you're not like everyone else. You felt that distance, that gap between you and the world that seems to move so effortlessly together. And now you know why. It's not because you're broken. It's because you're awake. You see what others are too comfortable to see. too invested to question, too afraid to confront. That's your gift. But gifts come with responsibility. And here's yours. What are you going to do with what you see? You've got two paths in front of you. The first one? Bitterness. You can let that outsider perspective turn into resentment, cynicism, a kind of intellectual superiority that isolates you even further. You can spend your life looking down on people who are still asleep, judging them, feeling superior. But that path doesn't lead anywhere worth going. It just turns your clarity into poison. The second path? That's where you take everything you've learned, all that existential awareness, all that hard-won insight, and you use it. You create something. You help someone. You build a life that's real, not because it fits society's script, but because it's authentically yours. You become the person who holds space for others when they start waking up. That's the path of the philosophical outsider who understands that seeing the truth isn't about being right. It's about being useful with what you see. Here's what I want you to ask yourself right now. And I mean really sit with this. What would your life look like if you stopped trying to fit in and started building something that actually matters to you? What if your alienation isn't a problem to solve, but a perspective to leverage? What if the very thing that makes you feel isolated is the exact thing the world needs more of? People who won't lie, who won't perform, who won't pretend everything's fine when it clearly isn't. The world doesn't need more people marching in the parade. It needs more people standing on the sidewalk, watching, questioning, thinking. And that's you. That's who you already are. If this video hit different, if something in here resonated with that part of you that's been watching from the outside your whole life, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications because we're just getting started. This community, it's for people like us. People who think deeply, question boldly, and refuse to accept comfortable lies. Every subscription, every like, every comment tells me you want more of this, and it helps us reach other outsiders who need to hear this message. So do that right now. Join us. Let's build something real together, because the world needs your perspective more than you realize. And you need to stop apologizing for seeing what others can't. Own it. Use it. Become it. I'll see you in the next one.